Hi folks, welcome to our first tutorial on the Doorbell channel, and today we're going to talk about how to vectorize your calligraphy. So we're going to take some calligraphy that I did on paper and scan it in and turn it into a vector. We're going to be using Adobe Illustrator CC and also Adobe Photoshop CC. I also use Google Photos for one portion, but there's a lot of different ways you can do that part. And then also if you have a different version of Photoshop or Illustrator, most of these tips will still apply. I learned on Adobe Photoshop Elements, which is kind of the less involved version of Photoshop, and the 2011 version. So you can do this on pretty much any program. So first of all, why would you ever want to vectorize something? So if you have been working with your calligraphy on paper and then scanning it in, you may have noticed that if you try to change the size of it, it kind of gets a little grainy. And then also you may have noticed that you get little pieces of the paper, no matter how good a photo or scan you do, it's kind of hard to clean that up and get rid of all the different shades of paper and shadow and all of those things. So vectorizing can help you get rid of a lot of that. So I'm just going to zoom in on this O that we made here to show you a little bit about how that works. So this O is a vector file, which is what you work with in Illustrator. And the opposite of vector is called raster, which deals in pixels. So vectors actually deal in angles. So you see these little points that we're making. I'm going to zoom in even further for you. So you see we have all these little points at very specific places, and it keeps saying path right here. So it actually takes this angle, this anchor point right here, and these little handles create an angle to the next point, and you make a closed path. So it's very mathematical, and the benefit to this is that if you make it bigger, I'm going to make this 200%, so twice as big. If you make it bigger, you can see that those anchor points are still in those same relative positions. So what this does for your calligraphy is it allows it to be resized to pretty much any size without losing the quality and the shape of your lines. We'll zoom back out really quick. So to start, I just did a piece of calligraphy on Rhodia paper, which is my favorite paper for scanning. It's very smooth, very clear. You can tell it's a little bumpy up here. I've even got some dirt on it, and this is my picture with my lovely thumbnail in it. So I put this on Google Photos, which is my favorite way to get things from my phone onto my computer. Sometimes I scan, sometimes I take pictures. It kind of just depends on what I'm doing. But this one was just actually a photo with my iPhone, so you don't even really need to scan it to get good quality. So I'm going to go ahead and download this. If you haven't used Google Photos, this is just an easy way to do that. And then I'm going to open up in Photoshop. So I've already done that here. So now we have our image here. The first thing that I like to do is crop to what we are working with. So you can go Image, Crop here, and then I like to zoom in a tiny bit. And if you're confused about any of the keystrokes that I might be using, I'll try to show them to you. But if you are confused about zooming in or anything like that, you can always Google how to do those little things on Photoshop. So zoom in is just Control or Command plus or minus for zooming out. So I'm going to use, so I'm just going to go up here, select the Move tool. Doesn't really matter. I just kind of, that's just a habit of mine. And I'm going to do Control L for levels. So the first thing I like to do is, the goal here is we're going to make the white background as white as possible and make the black letters as black as possible. And that's going to help us when we get into Illustrator with vectorizing. So for levels, that just kind of makes this a little bit easier for us. So I'm going to click on this white eyedropper over here. And you click anywhere in the background. I try to go with one of the darker points because that does the most work for us. But if you notice you're losing any of the detail in the black pieces, then maybe go to a lighter point. So then you click the black dropper, and I like to click right on the lettering there. And so that already has made the whites a lot whiter and the darks a lot darker. Then we have kind of some weird shadows here, but that's okay. So the next thing we're going to use is our burn tool, which is part of this little guy over here, burn tool. So what we're going to do, this has burn, and it also has dodge. So burn is going to make things darker, and dodge is going to make things lighter. So burn tool, and we're going to want to burn shadows, because we want to make all the shadows as dark as possible, and then we want to make all the highlights as light as possible. You can make this a little bigger, it just depends on what you're working with, but this is just going to make those blacks as crisp and as dark as possible, so we have tons of contrast. And then you're basically going to do the opposite with the dodge tool. So the dodge tool makes everything lighter, so we're going to get bigger again, and we want to make this the highlights. And I keep everything kind of exposure high on this one. I'm going to make this a good bit larger. And then you'll actually see this here. You can see those shadows just going away and getting lighter. So this is just going to help separate all those pixels from light and dark. So that will help us. Okay, perfect. So then what I do is I just kind of make a layer from the background. And I use this move tool over here. We're pretty much done in Photoshop. Another thing you can do if you want in Photoshop is delete out anything that you don't want. Like if you haven't cropped it yet, you can go ahead and crop it. You can delete these. For instance, if we really don't like you know, these V's, I did make some arrows on ones that I liked better. We could go ahead and delete those. You can also do this in Illustrator, so it's really not a big deal. But if I am using a lot of words or doing a lot of pieces at once, then I do like to kind of delete out certain sections so that I'm not distracted by some other ones. And I have found that if you trace too many words at once, you can kind of get weird results because you want to make sure you tailor your trace settings to what you need. So if you're doing a lot of different words, you might need to separate it into smaller sections of a few words at a time so you can get the exact right settings for those words. But for the most part, this is about, 10 different pieces, should be fine with the same settings. So I just use this move tool and I go ahead and drag this little guy into Illustrator, and it's always really big. So I zoom out because my artboard is 5x7, just for reference. So I like to trace everything at its original size, and then like I was mentioning, once it's traced, it's a vector, so you'll be able to resize it without losing any of the quality. So then I'm going to use the image trace function, so that's under Window and Image Trace. And if you're new to Illustrator, I've actually docked mine over here so that I can always just click on this guy when I need it. So you want to make sure this is all selected so you can see the blue box around it. And then my favorite preset is the sketched art preset, but you can find different results with all of these depending on what you want to do. So if you want to do things with different colors, if you want to keep some of your paper settings and let it kind of look a little bit more organic, you might want to use high fidelity photo. There's a few different options here, but my favorite that I found works the best for me is sketched art. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. You can also save a preset once you figure out what you like. So what I have here, I have this option to ignore white, so that if you don't click that, the whole white background becomes a path in and of itself, and then you just have to go through and delete it, and then you have to delete like inside this G and then inside this part of the G and all of that. So I like to ignore the white because then it just leaves me with just the black lettering. And since we've done all that cleanup in Photoshop, it looks really good here. Okay, so now we've got this nice traced file, and what you can do is you can play with these settings. There's a lot of different things, but the main one that I use is the threshold. So What you want is kind of a low threshold. This basically tells it how dark the pixel needs to be included in the results. So if you go up more, you're going to get more pixels, and those letters are going to be a little bit thicker. This is great if you're going to do laser cutting or anything where you need a thicker line. But if you want to keep it more organic looking, you kind of want the lowest setting that you can, because that'll keep your thin lines looking really nice and thin. And typically the reasoning for cleaning up in Photoshop is so that you can typically get a decent result if you don't clean up in Photoshop, but you'll be up here in that middle threshold level. Whereas if you clean up really well, then you can get down to this threshold, but you'll see if I keep going further down, I end up losing. This one's actually really well done, for the record. Didn't do that on purpose. But typically if you get really low, you'll start losing. Oh, this one is too good, I'm sorry. But some of those paths will start separating if it's a little too low, or if your lines are too thin on your page. So this is actually really good, and it's got really nice thin lines, so we'll just leave this how it is for now at this really low threshold. Paths, corners, and noise I don't really mess with too much, so I like to keep those where they are. And you can save, this is a custom preset, you can save that where you want it. I typically just start with a sketch chart and go from there, because each time I write is a little bit different, and you never know what's going to work perfectly. So then after this, you'll see that it's still one big block, and it doesn't have those anchor points yet, so it hasn't fully been vectorized. So in order to do that, you just have to click this expand button at the top. It takes a second, and then you have all these different paths that are outlined in blue. So now it's officially a vector. You can see all the little anchor points that they've got there. And if you're not familiar with Illustrator, there is a 30-day tutorial, 30-day trial period that you can do, and there's tons of tutorials online. This top selection tool will select a full closed path, which is everything we've got here, whereas this direct selection tool will select smaller things like anchors or paths. So I like to use the selection tool to move things around, and then if you're working with the exact anchors and changing the shape of your letters, then you'll use this direct selection tool. So right now this is all grouped together. So while it's still grouped, I'm going to make it smaller so it'll fit on our page, and the way I do that is enter for scale, or you can go up here to Object, Transform, Scale, and then I usually go with somewhere around 40. I might need to go a little bit smaller, 60%, and then that should fit over here, maybe a little bit smaller. There we go, and so now I'll zoom in on that artboard. And while it's still grouped together, you can do things that apply to everything, like putting the, working on the angle there, and then you can ungroup it. And so then when you're using that direct selection tool, when it's ungrouped, you can get rid of these little arrows. You can get rid of any letters that you don't love. This is where you can get rid of anything that you didn't crop out before. So it's actually really easy to do it here. I really don't like how this V ended up vectorizing, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. And I'm also going to delete some of this other stuff that I didn't like as much. Sometimes I like things on paper and then they vectorize differently, and so I don't like them as much or choose to use a different one. But I think the ones that I chose on paper are pretty good here, so I think I'm just going to keep these guys here, and then I might switch out this V to go with that one and delete this one. So I actually keep almost all my vectorized letters and words over here in this file, because you kind of never know when you're going to need to use the same word. Like if you need a little RSVP, I've got that here, ceremony, kindly reply. bunch of stuff, so this can just save you some time. I have a bunch of different ampersands and numbers somewhere. So I just like to keep all of that work in one file over here. So when you do vectorize, your letters will not necessarily be perfect. This is in a weird line, so I'm going to go ahead and move it. And then put these guys in order so we actually have the right word. Vectorizing is fun, yay! So I don't really want to get too much into how to use Illustrator, but I'll show you when you do vectorize, you'll notice that some of my letters are a little bit wonky, and what we can do, there's a few things we can do to fix that. So I'll show you, this is my font glyphs that I'm working on to create a font. So you can see that, for instance, this F has already been fully cleaned up. All these angles are really nice. And this F right here is really wonky. And that's because it's just got a ton of those little anchor points. See how many there are up here versus this one, which only has a few anchor points. And I would even argue that this is too many, and I'll probably even go less. So the fewer anchor points you have, the more smooth all of your curves are going to be. So some of these letters have already been cleaned up, whereas some of the wonky ones up here have not been cleaned up yet. So that's more natural with how it comes in on paper. And that's just because ink and paper, you're not going to get something 100% smooth. So there are going to be some of those bumps in there that you don't really notice on paper. But for a font or for something that you're printing out, you want it to be able to be used at almost any size, so you want to be able to have those, clean up a lot of those bumps and everything. So how you do that is by working with the anchor points themselves. So you use the direct selection tool to do that. My printer is going crazy right now. So you'll use the direct selection tool on there. And once you have your letters selected, you can do a few different things. You can move them around. You can move these anchors around if you want to. You can also add and delete points. Up here is where you delete them. And then adding will be this one, the pen tool over here. You can add points using that. And you can move the handles around to change the angles around all of them. So I'm going to zoom in here on the Z and show you a few things. So for instance, I definitely want this line right here to be more angled as opposed to these curves coming into the corners, because this crossover here should be a direct line perpendicular to this downstroke right here. It shouldn't be kind of this angled blob. So I'm going to select this anchor point right here, select the point itself, not the handles, and up here on the top left, you can convert it to a corner. So what that did is it made each angle stop at the point. So then I can make this a perpendicular angle. So that means that the handle over here to the left of the point and the handle to the right of the point don't affect each other. Whereas if you have this one's also a corner, actually. Just kidding, I'm going to get rid of that one. Whereas if you have this one up here, and I move, oh, that one is also a corner. These are all corners. Okay, this one should work. So if I have this one right here, and I move the right handle, it actually, let's just convert this one. Okay. If I move the right handle, it actually is going to affect where the left handle goes, and vice versa. Whereas if you make it a corner, then you can move the right and left ones without affecting the other ones. So you'll notice when I did delete that other one, this looks a little bit weird now. So what you can do is pull out these little handle points to work with the curve. You can also pull out the path itself, which will affect both of the handle points on either side of it. So you'll go through, and a lot of times I like to clean up my angles depending on how big this is going to print and how nice it needs to look. Another great tool is the smooth tool. It is over here under this shaper tool. If you right click it, you can do smooth tool, or you can just use E. And it gives you this little circle. And kind of what it does is just smooths out the path between anything that you select. So this one's a little bumpy over here. So if I just draw a line through all these points, it smooths them out, and you see how now that turned 4 or 5 points into just 2, and a lot of those bumps go away. So I love this tool. I use it so much for almost all my curves like this. If you want to, you can actually just click and it will do the entire path. So the entire path is the closed loop here. Sometimes I like that. I'm going to go back so you can see exactly what it did. You can see that again. So right here, it made that curve a lot smoother, but it made it really weird up in here. So I don't always like to do that. Sometimes it does work. Like it might work really well on this circle over in the O, but it kind of doesn't work if you do it on too many things because it tries, it just needs to be a little bit more focused to work effectively. So if you draw it over the points, it'll only smooth out the points that you draw it over at that point. So this takes quite a while. And convert that to a corner, move it a little bit here. And then another thing that I love to do is to delete points. Let me find a better spot to do that, probably over here. So over here on this G, there's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points in this angle. And that's not really necessary because each point is going to change the angle a little bit. And what we want is to make it as smooth as possible. So I'm actually going to select this anchor point and go up to this minus, remove selected anchor points, and remove that. And then I'm also going to remove the next 2. And so then I'll select this one over here on the end and use the handle to bring it down. And now you see that we have a much smoother curve right there. So some people actually use the pen tool to trace out 1 point by 1 point, and that's technically the way you're supposed to create vectorized lettering, but it takes forever. But one of the things that we can take from them is that you should have kind of as few points as possible. So you saw when I digitized that O earlier, let me go down to the font we had typed out. So if I were to create, so when you type something in, it's still editable, but if you do create outlines, it actually fully vectorizes it. So it now has those anchor points that we were talking about, and then the text won't be editable anymore. So I just want to show you how few anchor points these guys have. This is actually kind of a lot, but they pretty much only have 1 per line at the top, and then if it doesn't really change direction, this one does change direction a little bit right there. And then if it doesn't really change direction, they pretty much only have 1 or 2 extra points per line on that. Whereas if you go back up to my calligraphy, this F has like 15 points on this curve by itself, and a bunch going down here. So you want to keep in mind that you should have an angle change whenever your shape turns or has any kind of, maximum or minimum point is really, that's the technical way they do it, is they try to put a point at the top and then a point at the leftmost and a point at the rightmost and a point at the bottom. And that's kind of how you make a perfect circle. So in theory, you want as few points as possible, and if you haven't really changed direction, then you can kind of get rid of points. So I can get rid of this one, I can get rid of this one, and then you can use those handles and adjust the angles to fill them in, but it's going to be way easier to get a nice smooth line there, and you're going to get rid of a lot of those bumps and kind of awkward pieces. These U's always kind of look weird when I digitize them, so it's nice to just go through and delete this guy. And then I'll do the same thing down here. And then it's a nice straight line there. And then I'll end up, you know, turning this guy into a corner and moving it up a tiny bit. So then it's a direct downstroke, and it's not really that blob that you got, kind of like right here. So I'm going to go ahead and digitize a bunch of this stuff just to speed it up really fast for you guys in this video, just so you can kind of see where we end up and how much work it actually takes just to do a little bit of vectorizing calligraphy. Alright, so after many minutes, we have pretty much fully vectorized this. I always play with them a little bit more after looking at the whole piece, but this would be, you can scale this up to 300%, you can do it again, you can scale it back down, you can pretty much do whatever you want with it. You may also need to vectorize something if you are using a foil die or letter pressing or anything that requires a die. Screen printing typically requires vectors as well. If you're just printing something on a 5x7 piece and you wrote it at approximately the right size that it's going to print, then you most likely don't necessarily need to vectorize, but I still love to do it because it helps to clean up and just make my lines a little bit more smooth on my calligraphy. So that's how I vectorize my calligraphy. There's a lot of different ways that people go about this and little tips and tricks, so if you have any of your own, feel free to comment those below. If you have any questions about anything we've done during this process, if it's specifically Illustrator or Photoshop related, you can likely Google how to do some of those things or a little bit more information about some of those tools. But if you have any other questions, feel free to leave them in a comment below and I will get to them as soon as I can. Thank you all so much. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial.